This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Israel celebrates 70 years as a modern Jewish state. We take a look back at the Declaration of Independence and how it's fulfilled prophecy since then. Plus, conditions worsen for falsely accused American pastor Andrew Brunson. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Israel opened its 70th anniversary festivities with song, dance, and fireworks. Israel declared its independence on May 14, 1948. But here in the Jewish state, they marked their holidays according to the Jewish calendar. And even though there was a lot of celebration going on, they also commemorated the day under the shadow of an Iranian threat. Israel's national celebration wove a theme of technological progress and survival through 7 decades of its modern history. They told the story of the Jewish people from Moses to the early pioneers, through the Holocaust, to the planting of the land and the growth of technology. They said the rebirth of their nation was where prophecy became their reality and the answer to their prayers.
We prayed to God to return to Jerusalem, his city. And now, in 1948, 70 years ago, Jerusalem, his city, became available to us.
The Jewish prayers always talked about returning to Zion, returning to Jerusalem. And here we are 70 years in spite of all the things that have happened and the threats from Iran they talk about. There's still the technology and the things going on that really does seem quite miraculous.
Earlier, a siren wailed throughout the country as Israelis stood silent and remembered their fallen through their many wars and terror attacks. The commemoration and celebrations took place despite threats from Iran. An Iranian spokesman blamed Israel for an attack on an Iranian base inside Syria and warned Iran would retaliate. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel would face the Iranian threat.
Today also, we are not deterred from the struggle against those who strive to annihilate us, because we know how to defend ourselves with our own forces, which is the essence of independence.
Netanyahu also thanked President Trump and America.
We all appreciate the strong alliance with the United States. We all welcome President Donald Trump's historic decision to recognize Jerusalem as our capital and to transfer the embassy of the strongest power in the world to it. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, America.
The celebration ended with a rendition of the song Hallelujah for the things that were and the things to come. We'll have more on Israel's independence later in the show, but first we'll take a look at this news. Congress recently passed the Taylor Force Act, named after a U.S. citizen who was murdered by a Palestinian terrorist here in Israel. The law prevents U.S. aid to the Palestinian Authority if they continue the practice of paying convicted terrorists and their families. It's a policy called Pay to Slay. The new law sends a strong message to the Palestinian Authority, but they may not be heeding the message. When the Taylor Force Act became law, Congress expected the Palestinian Authority to get the message. CBN News spoke by phone with Congressman Doug Lamborn, who introduced the legislation to the House of Representatives.
It says a strong signal that we're not going to stand by when they take U.S. taxpayer dollars and turn around and give it to terrorists who have murdered innocent people.
Yet PA President Mahmoud Abbas ignored any signs, blatantly refusing to honor the new law, even though it could mean millions in lost aid.
في شغله دائما الامريكان بيقولوا لنا عليها انه احنا بنوقفها وهي رواتب الشهداء واسر الشهداء. طبعا نحن نرفض هذا رفضا قاطعا ولا نقبل باي حال من الاحوال انه حد يمس اسر الاسرى والجرحى والشهداء. هدول اولادنا وهدول اهلنا وهدول بنتشرف فيهم بنضل ندفع لهم قبل الاحياء.
the Palestinians are taking a hard line and they are defying the U.S., we should stop every single penny that goes to them until they change their policy.
Rewarding terrorists and their families has been built into the fabric of Palestinian society as well as its budget for decades. According to the Meir Amit Intelligence Center, this year is no different. For 2018, the Palestinian Authority still allocated about $360 million, or 7% of its budget, for this practice. The PA has budgeted this amount of money for the past 6 years. In the past, the PA disguised the sources of those payments. Now the funds are openly included in the 2018 budget, a move some interpret as clear defiance. Itamar Marcus of the Palestinian Media Watch first reported on payments to terrorists by the PA in 2011.
The great tragedy of, I would say, the last 20 years is that the Palestinian Authority acted like a terror organization. They sent terrorists to kill Israelis. They rewarded them.
Lamborn hopes other nations will follow the U.S. lead.
We would strongly hope that other countries would follow our lead, just as we hope they follow our lead in other areas like moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
If the international community united says to the Palestinians, if you act like a terrorist, you're not going to get our money, you'll be treated like a terrorist, I think that could have a very good long-term effect on changing the way the Palestinian Authority behaves.
After a hearing that lasted 12 hours, American pastor Andrew Brunson is back inside a Turkish prison cell. Using bogus charges, secret witnesses, and a legal system that does the bidding of the president, Turkey has severely stacked the deck against Brunson. However, the U.S. Congress is ready to punch back. Jennifer Wishon tells us what's next.
Until his next hearing on May 7th, Pastor Andrew Brunson is condemned once again to the notorious prison where he began his 18-month detention, the place where he lost 50 pounds.
He can never leave his cell, ever. Not to eat, not to go to the restroom, not to get some fresh air.
Christina Arriaga is one of just a few people who've seen Brunson. Despite severe overcrowding, he's isolated as the only Christian and speaks limited Turkish.
They're doing their prayers all the time so he doesn't sleep. He's anxious, he's nervous.
Now his Turkish attorney, who could be jailed himself, is facing a near impossible task.
They fabricate evidence. They have these secret witnesses that fabricate testimony, and it really puts you in a poor position to provide any kind of defense.
Pastor Brunson has no opportunity of a free and fair trial in Turkey. He is already smeared and condemned in Turkey's pro-government media. He has no attorney-client privilege.
Aykan Erdemir is a former member of Turkey's parliament. He says what's happening to Brunson reads like a science fiction novel. At his trial Monday, Brunson spent hours defending himself against the most ludicrous charges.
A text message to him by a colleague of his who tells him, "I'm sorry, I have diarrhea. I won't be able to make it to church." Any self-respecting, I think, court would have refused to entertain such accusations.
Brunson's defenders say his detention has nothing to do with the bogus charges against him. They contend he's a pawn for Turkish President Erdogan, who's holding him hostage to pressure the U.S. into extraditing several Turkish nationals and to settle his own paranoia following a failed coup attempt 2 years ago.
At the center of his paranoia is his fixation with the West and what he sees as the Judeo-Christian civilization. So this is part of his crusade against the West.
Now that Turkey's court has had a chance to do the right thing, bipartisan members of Congress are pursuing sanctions against Turkish officials who participate in the detainment of innocent American citizens. Since actions against Pastor Brunson and other Americans, they say, qualify as hostage-taking. Under Turkish law, Brunson could languish in prison for 7 years before courts take any action. If convicted, the 50-year-old father of 3 faces a sentence of 35 years. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News.
A look back at Israel's Declaration of Independence through the eyes of one handmaiden of history who was there. 70 years ago, a declaration signed in a Tel Aviv art gallery changed the world forever. Against overwhelming odds, this fledgling state of Israel not only survived, but grew beyond expectation. CBN's Scott Ross looks back at that moment and talks with a handmaiden of history who was there.
על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
Here in Independence Hall, David Ben-Gurion declared the birth of the modern state of Israel. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people had a nation.
He chose the words, we hereby declare the establishment, it says here, of a Jewish state in the land of Israel to be known as the State of Israel. This was the birth of a Jewish state, as for all Jews. Ben-Gurion was standing here as the voice of 11 million Jews around the world who had no voice, who had no address, and nowhere to go to.
I spoke with Isaac Dror, who leads the education effort here.
It was promised to us by God. We are the only people in the history of the world that live on the same land, speak in the same language, and believe in the same God more than 3,000 years.
We are in a historic setting here. Where are we and what happened?
This is the room where the Jewish state of Israel was born 70 years ago. In this tiny room with these same furnitures, a ceremony that lasted 32 minutes and shook the world.
As British rulers left Israel that day, 5 Arab armies invaded.
So it's like when you mix the happiest day for the Jewish people, one of the greatest moments for our nation in modern times, with one of the most dangerous and sad days when Israel was that close to a complete annihilation.
Why this building? Why here? Why Tel Aviv?
This building was simply the safest auditorium in the city of Tel Aviv.
Who were the people that were here?
Most of them people from around Tel Aviv, because they could not invite people from Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was disconnected. Only 350 of them were lucky enough to be squeezed in the room with no air condition.
And among the crowd of witnesses was Yael Sharet.
Her father was on the stage here, Moshe Sharet. He was the right hand of Ben-Gurion and the kind of the foreign minister of the provisional government of Israel. And when they came to the ceremony, they came with an invitation. And it says here, we are honored to invite you to the ceremony of independence. And then it goes, we ask you to keep it as a secret.
Really?
You don't want thousands of people to swarm the street when you expect an air raid later that day. And then it says the invitation is personal, like come alone. And here you have Mr. Moshe Sharet, who brought his daughter with him. And not only his daughter, but his sister as well. And Moshe Sharet said they will share the same chair.
I met Yael Sharet Medini at her home near Tel Aviv.
Here is my aunt, and this is my forehead. Hopefully there's something behind it, as I say. And we share the chair there, next to the wall.
She told me how just the day before, her father dictated and Yael wrote a draft of the Declaration of Independence.
This is my father's version of the Declaration. The one that he dictated to me, this is my handwriting. This is a photocopy of the original. Yeah. The original is in the archive.
And this took you how long?
I think that I sat there about 3/4 of an hour to an hour.
Yael simply calls herself a handmaiden of history. Well, how old were you?
17 and a half. I wasn't interested in this. I knew that this is what's going to happen from the age of 0, that we are going to have a state and we are rightfully here.
During that time, she and her family lived in New York, where her father would scour the United Nations, convincing countries to support the soon-to-be-born state. Do you remember the event itself, when Ben-Gurion stood up and read?
It's epic. It's really epic. It's poetry, actually. The only time I was really moved, I must say, was when the Rabbi Levine made the old age Jewish blessing, Shechianu v'kiyimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh.
That ancient Jewish prayer, recited on momentous occasions, thanks God who has given us life, sustained us, and allowed us to reach this day.
I'm not religious. But this blessing has an echo of generations.
Did you sing?
Hatikva, yes. And then everybody stood up, and it was the anthem, the national anthem.
The very next day, which was the Sabbath, President Harry Truman became the first world leader to recognize Israel.
The Pentagon and the State Department truly believe that Ben-Gurion, the leader of Israel, is leading the world into a new catastrophe. One person, however, thought differently. His name was Harry Truman. He understood something that most of his top advisors and ministers failed to see. This is truly a prophecy being realized.
70 years later, it's clear that Truman was right.
We are faster, better, prettier than ever today. The economy of Israel is doing wonderfully well. They call a startup nation. And now we see Israel standing, and thanks God, together with the Americans, in the spirit of those countries who are leading. Suddenly people understand why we are here.
Scott Ross for CBN in Tel Aviv.
Coming up, 70 years on how Israel is fulfilling prophecy and being a light to the nations. Here's a look back at where the infant state of Israel was in 1948, where it is today, and how it's fulfilling ancient prophecies.
על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
In the spring of 1948, Israel took its place among the nations when David Ben-Gurion announced the establishment of the Jewish state.
What was the situation in May 1948 when we were 600,000 people here, about half the size of a mid-sized American city, with basically handguns fighting 6 Arab armies that came within 25 miles of Tel Aviv, by the way. It's hard to imagine today. That surrounded Jerusalem, not far from where we're sitting. No economy, no allies, a population that was still languishing in displaced person camp in Europe after the Holocaust. I mean, think about that.
70 years later, Israel not only survived, but thrived.
Our economy has one of the highest growth rates in the world. We have one of the most powerful armies in the world leader in technology. Israel is regularly listed one of the 7th or 8th most powerful countries in the world. In a historical perspective, I think that Israel's situation is nothing less short of miraculous.
Israel's continuing miracle is not only that it's thrived, but now helps nations in need.
Because we're a light unto the nations. That's the great fulfillment of that great prophecy. And in fact, that's what Israel is doing. People say, well, what do you do? I mean, what is it that you get out of it? And the answer is, we're not getting out of it anything. We're fulfilling our deepest values. Israel is a light unto the nations.
Israel is not just going to the nations, but now the nations are coming to Israel. The company is called Our Crowd. That's brought 10,000 people from 90 countries around the world here to Jerusalem for a high-tech summit, bringing together innovation and investment.
Turns out that Israel is really the second most important source of innovation and innovative companies in the world outside of the United States and Silicon Valley. We're called the startup nation. We're looking here across the walls to Jerusalem in our ancient history. We've always been dreamers here in Israel, whether it's back in the time of Abraham or the prophets. There's always been incredible good news to come from this country. And today the good news is about innovation and technology.
And 70 years on, Israel is protecting the birthplace of the good news and more. Shahar Shiloh serves as a consultant for the Tower of David Museum in Jerusalem. He says Israel, since its founding, has preserved the historical and biblical sites, dug into its ancient past, and opened its door to people of all faiths.
Tourism is much more than just making money. Tourism is making friends. Tourism is making advocacy. Tourism is making your partnership around the world a lot safer. Our, mutual basis grows stronger with every tourist being in Israel, living back home, and talking about Israel wherever he lives. This is something that we cannot achieve without tourism.
Shiloh says a visit to Israel for Christians should be a personal mission.
We're always saying, before coming to Israel, you read the Bible, you see it in black and white. Once visited Israel, in every chapter, every story, every time you read about Paul, Peter, or Jesus, or St. Mary, it's all vivid and vibe. And everything becomes in full color, full HD, 4K. Something happens in your soul and you're never, well, we say you'll never be the same again. This is my message to our brothers and sisters from the Christian world. Visiting Israel is a part of your soul and your heritage, not mine only.
Up next, how the dry bones of Ezekiel became a popular cartoon in Israel and around the world. Dry Bones is one of the most well-known cartoons in the world. It's read by millions, and the creative genius behind the cartoon, Yaakov Kirshen, explains how he came up with the unusual name for his work.
When I came to Israel and decided I would start doing a cartoon, I thought, well, I needed a name, like Kirshen's Corner, with corner spelt with a K. And I kept thinking, what should it be? And then I realized that one of the things that had brought me to Israel was my reading of the book of Ezekiel. And in the book of Ezekiel, this guy Ezekiel, who lived 2,600 years ago, saw a vision of what to him was the far future. And that was of a time when it looked like the world had destroyed the Jewish people. But at that point, we would come out of our graves, and the image he saw was of a valley filled with dry bones, like the knee bone connected to the shin bone and all like that. And in that imagery, he saw the rebuilding of the Jewish state. He saw the coming together and the ingathering of the Jewish people. He saw the rebuilding of the cities and the planting of the trees. And therefore, if I was going to do a cartoon about what was happening today, all I could do would be to add to what he had seen incredibly 2,600 years ago. And so I decided to call it Dry Bones.
From the dry bones in the book of Ezekiel to the Declaration of Independence by David Ben-Gurion, we've seen how Israel as a modern-day miracle and a sign to the nations that God fulfills His promises. Well, that's all for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.